Is a dogma lesson just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hello, and welcome to an interview episode of the TEFLology podcast. Matt and Rob recently attended a symposium at ICU, the International Christian University in Tokyo, titled Identity and Mobility in the Globalized World: Challenges for Education. One of the invited panelists at the symposium was Professor David Block, and Matt and Rob were fortunate to sit down and talk to him after his presentation about a range of topics, with a focus on social class in applied linguistics and ELT. Professor David Block's interests include globalization and its social-linguistic consequences, neoliberalism and applied linguistics, and the transnational cultural and language practices of migrants. He has authored and co-authored several books and articles on these and other subjects, and is a featured speaker at conferences around the world. We hope you enjoy their discussion.
Okay, so I'm Matt.
And I'm Rob.
And we're joined here by Professor David Block at the International Christian University in Tokyo. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I just wanted to start, I went to one of your talks a couple of weeks ago, and you plotted the development of your career through your book titles.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you can describe that journey for us.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little more to it than that. I mean, if we go back to when I first started teaching English, and this was about the time I left the U.S. where I'd grown up. So by 1979, January 1979, I was teaching English very badly in Barcelona, by the way. And I wasn't qualified, so typical sort of native speaker, you've got a BA, you can teach English sort of thing. But from there, I eventually did an RSA course, Royal Society of Arts, TEFL diploma course. It lasted a year. Did that during 1981 and 1982. Because by that time I knew I wanted to stay in Barcelona, and I figured there's more to this teaching. I was finding it frustrating that I seemed to be so thick I couldn't learn on the job. It just wasn't working. And then that got me interested in teaching. Not only did it kind of inform me about teaching, and at that time it was communicative language teaching was the rage, and I learned a lot. There was a degree of applied linguistics, more academic stuff. And I think from 81, 82 onwards, I actually enjoyed teaching, and I really invested a lot of myself in it. And I kind of sort of crawled up the ladder of language academies in Barcelona, eventually did an MA in 1985, and from there I got a job in a very prestigious business school in Barcelona, and from 85 to 96 I worked there. I had an administrative post. I was very good job and everything, and I think I just continued to develop as a teacher, and there was a degree of being a showman. I think there was a kind of a working theory, whether you'd studied language teaching or not. I had a colleague who knew nothing about all the theory, but he kind of had a theory of engagement, that if he kept people entertained and changed activity every at least every 10 or 15 minutes, that they were more likely to learn. But whatever the case, from 85 onwards, there was a point around 1988 I started doing a little bit of part-time teaching on MA programs in TESOL or applied linguistics, and I was teaching a classroom research module, and really it was an excuse to talk about a lot of issues like motivation and other things in language teaching. And I did that in 1995. I finished a PhD at Lancaster, most of it at a distance. I was living in Barcelona. I did my research there. And of course, along the lines there, doing the research, that was what was around me. I decided to do my PhD on learner perceptions. It was a contrast between what I always wondered what students think is going on. What's going on in there? What are they thinking about what I'm doing, for example? What sense do they make of lessons? And so I set up a study looking at that. I also set up a study based on end-of-course evaluation forms, which is kind of a critique of that, interviewing people as they did them, and various things. I was doing a lot of interviews that were either talk to me about your language learning experiences, or talk to me about this questionnaire that you're asked, each course you do, you're asked to complete it. And all of that was going on as I was doing the PhD. And in 1995, I finished the PhD. In September 95, I did my viva in Lancaster. And from there, it was a year where I kind of was getting restless because I couldn't really break out of the part-time teaching at the university. The business school I worked at didn't open up opportunities, academic ones, for me to develop. And in 1996, I got a job in London, which I was quite surprised to get, but I got it at the Institute of Education, University of London. More recently, it's changed to Institute of Education, University College London, but that's another story. And then I moved in '96 to London, and after 18 years in Barcelona, and the first year I was alone. I was traveling back and forth. Eventually, my wife and son came over. And so there was a London experience, which for me lasted 16 years. And during that time, I was already shifting my reading, because I always kind of follow what's around me, but also what I'm reading. Or I read what I read because something's going on or whatever. But things kind of drag me along. I know it doesn't work that way, but it seems that way. So I sort of start following the logic of what I'm reading. And in London, I was surrounded by suddenly this kind of multiculturalism, multilingualism, and I think that had an effect on how I was seeing things. I was reading things on globalization, reading things on sociology. So I kind of went from language teaching and learning interests, to globalization, sociology, eventually identity, multilingualism, multiculturalism. These are kind of key terms, and they came to kind of guide the way I was thinking and what I was actually interested in. And over time in London, teaching on MA programs, probably my first couple of years, I was first put on doing an SLA module, which I did for a few years, which I could sort of more or less manage. And I also did things on curriculum development and language teaching and that type of thing. But by the time we get to the end of the last century, if you like, 2000, 2001 onwards, as I was developing my reading in this direction and thinking, and also what I was actually starting to publish about, there's a 2001 book I co-edited with Debbie Cameron, the Globalization in Language Teaching, and that really marked the kind of beginning, if you like, of really a new era for me. Eventually in 2003, The Social Turn in Second Language Acquisition, which I saw as kind of a swan song to SLA. I really wasn't that interested in SLA. I kept being asked after the book to talk, to critique SLA from a social perspective. But anyway, that kind of went on for a few years. And eventually, 2006 and 2007, the two books around identity. And so by that time, I'm really doing different things. And I'm also teaching modules on multilingual, multicultural London, and also on identity and issues like that. So everything's kind of falling into place. And the last kind of transition really was the crisis from 2007, 2008 onwards. I was already familiar with a few things around economics, political economy, maybe better said. And I started working on, David Harvey as an obvious source of a lot of information for people. And so from 2008 onwards, I'm already sort of firmly identifying myself more in the realm of sociolinguistics. Not so much the linguistic side, but certainly the socio side. And now added to all the other stuff in sociology, I'm adding political economy and starting to look at social class. Social class had come up in my earlier work on identity, and I did flag it in my 2007 book as a key area that people needed to look at. Well, now I started really, pushing that kind of agenda. And neoliberalism is the big word that comes up when you look at political economy. In 2012, I got the job I have now, which is working for the Catalan government. It's a bit complicated to explain, but they pay my salary. I'm hired to enhance and to act as kind of a catalyst in the research environment at a university in Catalonia. The one I'm working at is west of Barcelona, Universitat de Lleida. Right. And so, I sort of commute there 1 or 2 days a week. A lot of the work I do at home, because I'm doing a lot of reading and writing and that sort of thing. And so the last 3 years have been very good, and I've got a lot of things coming out around these issues around social class and political economy, and so that's kind of the way I've gone. What I have sort of found a disconnect from, in practical terms, I stopped teaching English in 1996, in the summer of 1996. From that time, I never taught English again. And then in the years during London, I shifted my interest away from more direct things, to the point by the time I left London in 2012, to students on the MA TESOL program, I could engage with and I could supervise people writing about motivation and language teaching and that type of thing. I could do those things. I was knowledgeable enough, but from the past, but it wasn't really what I was about really. And so there was kind of a disconnection. I often found myself telling people, I'm never going to tell people what to do in the classroom because I'm so disengaged, and apart from the fact that you might teach in a classroom in one context, which is very different from the one I knew before anyway. So again, and I realized maybe, who was I talking to? You kind of think when you're giving talks, who are you actually talking to? When you're writing papers, who are you communicating with? And I'm starting to wonder, maybe I'm only communicating with a handful of people who are interested in the same thing. But maybe, I find it challenging here. I gave a talk for JALT, but then only 13 people came. So but those were people probably more interested in things beyond language teaching.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
So there's always an audience somewhere, but sometimes I could do a seminar around language teaching. It might be a big challenge and try to bring in all these things, but I find myself stopping at some point because I kind of feel like I don't have the authenticity, if you like, to talk about it.
We'll maybe ask you some questions about language teaching, hopefully, if that's okay.
Oh, no, it's fine. I mean, I'm immersed in I work in 3 languages regularly every day, and so I'm quite interested in language learning, if you like, and I am interested in the classroom side, and I've just put in a grant proposal for looking at English medium instruction in higher education. So that's very much about language teaching. So I am in there.
Okay, right. You mentioned that you're currently doing a lot of work on social class. For our listeners, can you quickly just identify what you mean by social class?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I could refer to my little model, which I'm presenting. But social class, the beginnings, if we go back to Marx, we look at it very much in economic terms. And of course, with Marx, you had 2, depending on how you look at it, 3 classes, but looking at the proletariat and the capitalist class, if you like. I think what's important to realize is Marx was commenting on, he was interested in England as the first European country to industrialize, and he was looking at the effects of that first stage, if you like, of industrialization. Certainly, as we go, we move away from Marx and we go to people like Durkheim, but above all Max Weber. Max Weber is looking at a societies around the turn of the century, and in 1922 writes the massive 2-tome volume on society, and I've got the title now, but anyway, he's bringing in not only the economic base, but he has notions of the market, and he's got notions above all of status, respect that people can garner through their economic condition, but also there's another world which is far more socio-cultural, and I think a lot of people became attracted to Weber, and it actually probably dropped from Weber. There is a strong economic angle in his work, but they ran a lot with the more socio-cultural model, and I think evolved away from the material basis as being so important. The material basis of society being how production takes place and how work is organized in society, moved away from that to a more socio-cultural agenda, and we get into issues around identity and that type of thing, but we leave behind the class issues, and that certainly happened in North America, I think, and it certainly has happened in other parts of the world. So, defining class as a strict definition, I think most people would say nowadays that there's a material side which has to do with the economic base of society, and there's also a socio-cultural side having to do with any number of phenomena related to things like status and position in society.
Right. In your book, your 2013 book, Social Class in Applied Linguistics, and in your talk here today, you mentioned that Tony Blair called for the replacement of the class system in the UK with more of a meritocracy.
I don't think I mentioned that, but I do in the book. Okay, sorry, in the book, yeah, I do mention that, yeah.
So, to what extent do you think the ELT industry is a meritocracy?
Or that it buys into the notion of the meritocracy? Well, I think to the extent that education in general has become, and it seems to be the case in many countries, obviously Japan will evolve into that in a very different way from the United States or a Western European country, but the move to individualization, or to the focus on the individual and the valuing of the individual, which has come with a lot of the post-structuralist approaches to social sciences and humanities, but also is part of what people call the neoliberal agenda, which is kind of see the individual as a set of skills. And so I think the ELT industry very clearly has aligned itself with that.
Right.
And of course, it is perfectly possible to combine social liberalism with a neoliberal economic agenda. So you have the most repressive forms. You have a form of capitalism, which is sort of savage capitalism, under which we've got this huge gap between rich and poor growing to varying degrees in different countries around the world. And yet we have at the same time quite a few gains made in the realm of the social in terms of civil rights and that type. If you look at GBLT rights, for example, gay and lesbian, and bisexual. I mean, if you look at this sort of thing, if you look at the laws that are in place in many countries, if you look at just the general conditions, and by no means is this over. I mean, Spain's interesting because one of the first countries to have gay marriage, as it's known in the media, but at the same time, in recent times, polls are showing a rise in homophobia among young males, for example. So we kind of have we're working at multiple levels in society when this goes on. But I think there have been great advances, and we could apply that obviously to race and ethnicity and the kind of respect agenda. The kind of, this is not to say at all that racism has disappeared from any society around the world or any society, but it is to say that things are better. Right. And I think to argue that there's been no change in a country like the United States would be a bit, I don't see how. One could argue that the change is not as great as some might think, or that there's still a profound racism at the heart of American society. For me, that's a different argument. But I think there have been advances. And I think most people would recognize that. And yet, the advances are happening at the same time as we're getting a really regressive form of capitalism taking hold. And we're still living through it because the solution to the crisis seems to be more of the same. Austerity is the big thing going on, and it's just exacerbating the situation, particularly in Southern Europe, where I'm living.
I wanted to ask you, maybe a follow-up from that, I wanted to ask you about the occupation of being an English language teacher. Are there any trends in class that are reflected in becoming an English language teacher?
Well, I wonder. I think when I was working, a good thing to look at maybe, when again this ended for me in 1996, but that doesn't mean it's still the situation. It probably still is the situation. If I looked around me in the staff room, we had 50 full-time English teachers, so quite a few. There was a native speaker policy, right, which was questioned in some cases, because you had, what about the children of one of these British person who'd been living in Barcelona all their life, and they sent their kid to the university in Britain. There were things like that where they're really native speakers. But in general, you had a kind of 40-40 split between roughly British and American, and then you had Australians, you had Irish, and everything. If I looked at all, if I look back, I think all these people were from, like myself. I grew up in a middle-class household in the United States. I think most of them, if not all of them, were from, not all of them, but most of them were from middle-class backgrounds, and a few had gone to public schools in Britain, for example. So they were obviously probably from another station in society. But you could have had somebody who went to a grammar school in Britain, so a working class background, and I wouldn't have necessarily known that, sort of thing. But I think in general, certainly the ethos, we were middle class people. Most of the people I worked with were staying in Barcelona for the rest of their lives, and I think that's been borne out. Now, 19 years later, I think most of them, at least the core of them, at least half of them, let's say, have stayed, and many of them are now retired and everything else. They were middle class. There was a time in Barcelona where I sort of intuitively realized I'd become kind of middle class. That's starting in the low-level academies. Once I got to this business school, I actually had a pretty good income, and my wife was a French teacher. She's from Barcelona, and we had a reasonable enough existence. We had a flat, and we lived our lives and everything. So, and I remember thinking, I said to somebody, I'd become, I'm trying to become a good middle-class Catalan. Sort of thing, that's my job in life. So I think language teaching has that, and I think the materials that are used. This is a point I've made. A couple of things. Maybe not surprisingly, because they're part of more general education in a way. And not just English language texts, probably if you look at French and whatever. There's a middle class ethos there, because what else would there be, I suppose? But if you look at the kind of people who are presented, and in a sense, there's and John Gray's written about this, there's an aspirational element. When people study English, for example, it's interesting to look at how the books show them potential role models, even.
Right.
And John's pointed out, for example, the texts they have on the famous people. Well, they would have, Bill Gates is a typical example, film stars. But there's a kind of a veneration for success, and I'm not against success, but I mean, and there might even be falling into, somebody like Bill Gates just has so much money, and mentioning that, he has enough money to, buy 3 countries or something like that, and so I think there's just really these texts are imbued with this kind of capitalist ethos, if you like. Right. What else would it be again? But the sort of what the carrier content, as it used to be called, is very much in line with the kind of status quo of economic systems around. There's no questioning of that. What they have become also at the same time, and this goes back to what I said about things working in parallels, they're very multicultural. They're even starting to include non-native speaker English, and crucially, they're including English in where English is spoken widely, such countries like Nigeria or India. They're being seen more as English-speaking nations, and so people from those countries are being used in the book. So again, there's been a liberalization, if you like, and it was highly overdue. For a long time, there's been attention to gender balance and in representation and everything. So all that's kind of cool and nice, and very necessary. And the imagery is wonderful, with advances in photography and just everything is much better. The books are much nicer and everything. But all I would say is that they're not really questioning the kind of regimes that are generating the inequality we have in the world, and it's kind of you're oblivious to that. And I just kind of wonder, you wonder about the use of these books, and if you did have a classroom, because everybody has to learn English. Well, in different parts of the world, there are kids studying English who probably, given their life chances, might not ever have an opportunity to use it because they can't travel, they don't have money to travel. What do they make of this? Is it somehow? Is it interesting argument would be if they're not living in a very aspirational environment, would somehow the English textbook for 1 or 2 individuals in the class actually lead them to aspire? I want to be more, so I'll have to learn English. Buying into the argument, but actually, learning English, thinking that's going to get me out of where I am. I don't know, right. But I don't think there's a particularly progressive agenda. It's a business, obviously, that we work in, and that's not to attack any individual English teacher. I think we have to be careful about talking about bigger issues like this and making people feel bad about what they're doing. And I was an English teacher for 18 years, so, and I did that, yeah.
Do you think that there are certain gatekeeping practices within ELT? For example, to do certificate courses, usually you have to have a degree, and to get jobs abroad, usually you have to have a degree, or there's the native speaker requirements, that kind of thing. Do you think that there are these gatekeeping practices in play to protect the sort of the class identity of the industry?
Well, yeah, I mean, that would be the end result, really. Another question to ask is what kind of people are predisposed to go far away from home, right. Even if once they have a degree, and look at study abroad. It's a couple of interesting things coming out on study abroad, and one in particular by Mambalia Thomas, which is an article that appeared about 2 or 3 years ago. It was a special issue I edited of a journal, and it's quite interesting. It was looking at African Americans and even middle-class African Americans in universities, and that the rate of taking up the offer to go and study abroad among that population was much lower than other groups, and particularly when compared to white students from similar backgrounds. Right. And there was, she was kind of speculating about this, and she herself was African American and thinking, and she had gone on a study abroad program in her university years, and so the interesting study because it raises the issue of maybe being sensitive to racism at home, thinking why. I don't know what's out there, and maybe I've seen things on television. So why should I go to a country and set myself up? Or I would be thinking about all the time. I'll be thinking about why did someone going to say something stupid to me or something, and then so you don't go. Right? So I think that's an interesting thing. There's a racial issue there, but in class terms, the little bit where classes come up and study abroad, there seems to be the kind of people who end up on study abroad tend to be middle class, because most of the students who are inclined to study things that might take them there come from middle-class families. That's not everybody. There will be exceptions. And in the European context, to an extent, you could argue the same thing. Right. So it's kind of, I don't know, it's not really chicken and egg, but where do you actually start to take these things on if you do want to take them on? And some things run so deep in society that maybe if you're going to do something about what you see on a sort of surface level going on, which is not to say it's superficial, by the way, it's on the surface level, what do you actually do? And if it involves, total change in the economic system, well, that's a really big question, So what can we do about that?
Right. Just changing topics slightly. You focus a lot these days on social class and bi- and multilingual research. Yeah. I'd just like you to describe what are some of the trends that you've been encountering with your current research.
Well, I'm sort of starting that now, and the study I'm working on now, in a way, looks at the intersectionality, of course, which intersectionality is simply about the way that, well, first of all, you can't talk about one dimension of identity without bringing in other ones, at least not in a very effective way. But in fact, how, what is the interrelation? I mean, or how, for example, class identities could be racialized or gendered, that type of thing. That's what you're looking for in intersectionality. So the intersectionality I'm looking at is that by multilingualism, in the context of Barcelona and Catalonia, in terms of Catalan and Spanish, and a kind of the push to learn English, so English comes into the equation as well, that intersects with being from a working class background, which is part of being from an immigrant background. And so the study I'm working on now with my colleague Lidia Gallego is to look at that situation. What is there out there? I mean, there's a chapter coming out in a book edited by Suresh Kanagaraja, which sort of what I talked about today, there's a few things in that, and that'll be out in 2016, I think. That, what I do, it's like everything I look at in applied linguistics in general, I kind of come to the conclusion, well, yes, okay, some people are doing this, that, or the other, but there's nobody doing the kind of full-blown class analysis that might be very interesting. But also, as I said, in migration studies in general, if that's what we're looking at, the movement of people and people settling in different places, there's not much on social class either. So, the answer to that question is what's out there, what are the trends? I would hope the trend might be that people start looking in an intersectional manner, possibly. When you do intersectional research, the other thing to realize is that you probably do start from a base. That there is one dimension of identity you're most interested in. Right. Bell Hooks is a fascinating scholar. She wrote a book in 2000 about class that a lot of people don't know about. But that was coming from her base as a black feminist. And, I think throughout her career, there's this issue of going back and forth between, it doesn't, you could say it doesn't have to be that way, but in a sense maybe it does. Is race more important or is gender more important in her work? And there are scholars who might be in a situation, I mentioned this the other day actually, might say, well, I'm in a situation where I'm being discriminated against. So if I find out later I was discriminated against as a woman as opposed because I was black, I might feel relieved. So that suggests maybe that the deep down, most hurtful discrimination is racial, and that has to do with historical things and everything else. So again, I'm starting to social class. I'm kind of turning it all around. As somebody for a long time I was very interested in race, for example. Not so much necessarily in my writing, but I've just always been interested in race. And now I'm just putting social class first, and then seeing how moving outward from social class as my base into how is social class racialized? So if I look at if I'm looking at the children of immigrants in Barcelona with my friend Victor Corona, and all his research is about Latinos in Barcelona, well, he would start probably more in the kind of realm of Ben Rampton's work. So he's interested in repertoires, and he's interested in how these people are racialized. There's, if you're from a a Latin American background, they even talk about in Spanish and Catalan having a South American appearance, as if there was only one, or but what it means is somebody with darker skin, that kind of thing. And so again, they how is you could start looking at race, but if you look at them in terms of class, in terms of their migrant status, the children of immigrants, they're in a working class, or even if you like a lower class environment, living their lives that way. And then are they racialized only because the difference in skin color, or does the race become important because they're in the lower class position? So it's easier to be racist against them because not just darker skin, but they are in that position. Because at the same time, if somebody showed up who was black but was an entertainer, or somebody who's well known, or a politician, people might show a totally different attitude towards them. Right? So again, these things intersect, and we have to break them apart. We have to keep them together. And so intersectionality in my case is starting from class, and I'm not sure, I'm kind of rambling now, so back to that.
And so maybe just to wrap things up, so for our listeners who may be interested in learning more about social class in applied linguistics, what would you recommend as places to start with in terms of reading? Well, that's going to sound self-serving, isn't it, if I say read my book? Sort of thing. That's okay. Well, I do think, I think there's, you could read my book and read a very interesting review of it by Alistair Pennycook in Applied Linguistics a few months ago, which is, critical, but I think, he obviously read the book and was interested in it and that kind of thing. So,
So in the book, what I do is I talk about social class in great detail on my own journey through reading, and it's somewhat self-indulgent, but I'm just trying to say, look, I started here. Maybe I'm like you, I started reading this stuff out of nowhere almost, and just ended up, with a kind of theory of social class, and then I do a critique, and it's almost, I'm repeating the same argument. If I look at, what I might call sociolinguistics, or by multilingualism research, or language teaching, or different areas of applied linguistics, I find there's not a continuous and sustained agenda putting social class central. Now, there could be reasons well, it's not important. That could be the reason. When people don't research something, maybe it's because it's not very important. But certainly in early sociolinguistics, there was social class. It disappeared. It came back. I think in language teaching and learning, it's never really made much of an appearance. And I think what I'm trying to get around is people say, well, I've got social class in my work. Or what they've done is say, well, there's a series of things that are important. Or they just make a comment, this is a middle class person, but they don't actually problematize what they mean by middle class. And so what I try to do in the book and further publications that I'm working on, things that are coming out, I try to come up with a model of different dimensions, as many dimensions as possible, which might index class, because class will be indexed by possessions, but also indexed by the kind of supermarket you shop in, that type of thing. And I'm trying to do that and thinking, any problem around language, how does it intersect with that? And it's kind of an exercise I'm engaged in now, because I've been asked to write a lot of things like, multilingualism in class, or, politics and language in class, or critical discourse analysis in class. So I'm kind of touching all these different bases, and it's a challenge, because I end up with the same base, which is kind of writing the same thing about social class, but trying to connect it outward. So I'd say, read my stuff, but I think, Ben Rampton's book from 2006 was a major influence on me, and I think it's looking at London schools, it's looking at language in London schools and multiple repertoires that people have, but above all the kind of London English the kids speak, and he makes comments about how this might relate to class. Although he doesn't find a lot of self-referential examples to class, which means the kids aren't living their lives. They're living their lives much more in terms of ethnicity, race, even religion, but not in terms of class. And what does that tell us? Does that tell us class isn't important, or does it just tell us that the idea of class for itself, that class as a self-conscious process isn't there really for them? It doesn't mean that class in itself, that actually embedded in their lives, doesn't mean that doesn't exist or something. So that's a contrast from Marx, actually. So again, we have this, literature. Okay, there was a special issue in the Journal of Language, Identity and Education, edited by Jessica Panel, 2014. We later had a panel where I was actually on the panel with the people in that. There's not that much, and that's what I'm trying to see if more things will come out, because when I do go around talking about this, I do find people interested. Some people can shut it down and say, well, class, basically class isn't looked at because it's not interesting, or class doesn't exist. But I try to get people to think around that and say, well, let's assume that it does, and then think about how it does as an exercise. And so in Japanese, there's actually a lot of work in sociology on the class system in Japan, and yet some people might say that Japan has a more egalitarian approach to society, certainly a more collectivist society in social terms than maybe Western European countries, but that doesn't mean that there's not stratification in society. There certainly is. And so, reading was your question. I mean, there's not that much really. It's just a question of, and unless you want to go into sociology and political economy, and then and that's what I've done really, and that's where I'm reading the most. So if you want to take that kind of route, well, fine, but it's going to take you off the path you might have been on, but it could be very rewarding in the long run, because you can use what you're reading to apply to new contexts, or contexts where people haven't thought about those things. And that's kind of the point of what I'm working on.
Right. So maybe for our listeners, if they haven't thought about these issues, just reading maybe your book or some of the other literature you mentioned will be a gateway for them to
exactly, to start thinking in those terms.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. I mean, I hope.
So that was Matt and Rob's interview with Professor David Block. We'd like to thank Professor Block once more for agreeing to talk with us, and we hope this has encouraged you to learn more about his areas of interest and to read some of his books or articles if you've not done so already. As usual, thank you for listening. We always enjoy getting feedback from our listeners, so please feel free to contact us at teflology@gmail.com, or follow us on Twitter @teflology, or leave a review or rating on iTunes. We also have a Facebook page called the TEFLology Podcast and a website, teflology-podcast.com. where you can find all of our previous episodes and leave comments. Thank you again, and we'll be back next time with a regular episode. Goodbye.